Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, editor of Forbes Women. According to exit polling, 91% of Black women voted for Vice President Kamala Harris in the 2024 presidential election. That community and communities of so many women and women of color have been reeling in the wake of the vice president's loss to President-elect Donald Trump. Joining us now is a woman who founded an organization dedicated to increasing political power for those very constituents, women of color. That's Amy Allison. She's the founder of She the People. Amy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Very proud to be part of the 91%.
And you founded She the People in 2018 to increase political power for Black women and women of color. What is the primary question you've been getting in the days since the election from your community?
I mean, I founded She the People, you're right, in the wake of Trump winning the White House the first time. And the questions that people had been asking about how do we understand the women's electorate? How do we advance women's rights? And what's the relationship between gender and race? And I think She the People was the answer to all of those questions because it identified groups of people in the United States whose were an increasing percentage of the percentage of overall voters who were the majority of women in many states like my home state, California, and yet we're not recognized for our ability to turn out the vote, increase engagement among communities, Black and Brown communities that had been ignored by both parties, and who were holding this vision of a future of America that had an expanded democratic franchise and expanded equality, gender, economic, and racial justice. I, I just want to say this has been a very hard week. It's been a hard week because we were hoping, I know I am just going to speak for Black women. We were hoping that given the contrast and the opportunity for America to have a Kamala Harris who was going to work with Congress to guarantee our reproductive rights and provide a path to citizenship and defend our voting rights and a whole number of things that really were building the foundation for a multiracial society and a society that was more equal and more just. That when we had that opportunity, that the majority of Americans would choose it. And what we saw this week was that they took someone who's arguably a terrible person, a convicted felon, a person who used racism and talked about women's bodies and grabbing women's bodies and all of the things. They chose him over a Black woman. And I think to the extent that Black women had been advancing a notion of a multiracial democracy and society and a real turning the page from a past, given that we've only had to, vote since 1965, really we're holding for America this idea that we could evolve. And we have been, once again, disappointed, really, really disgusted with the results of the election. And I will say that in the US, we have to deal with the original sin. I mean, we're never going to have a woman in the White House, a white woman, a woman of color, any woman, until we deal with the problem of white supremacy in this country. 53% of white women voted for Trump. You could argue it's against their own interests, but if we understand race and how that provides a framework for political action, then we understand what we've got before us. The problems facing America, they're getting in the way of gender equality and racial equality, are bigger than politics. And we've got to, we really have to deal with that, or we are not going to be able to move forward.
It's a big question on a week that has been very heavy, and I'll caveat this by saying a lot of the women in the circles that I see on the internet are saying, take the time you need to process the news from Tuesday night. Don't rush your grief if grief is what you are feeling. But What is the first step you will take as the leader of She the People to move forward, to answer those questions? I mean, you alone cannot solve the systemic issues facing America. Let's be very clear about that. But for the organization you lead and for the community that you lead, what do you think your first step will be after this election?
I mean, part of it is that I have a lot of grief inside me. I mean, it's funny. It's like I just got back from DC, so I was with the campaign and on the campus of Howard University in DC, watching the returns come in, surrounded by really really young people of all different backgrounds, but very young women. It was heartbreaking as we saw the returns come in on the jumbotron, and I think that day I was sort of numb. I wasn't feeling my body. And then yesterday I was raging. And today tears are flowing, not just for me, but for other people. And I think you're right. We have to take time to feel the grief. I think, by the way, I'm grieving something bigger than a political loss. Um, I'm grieving the fact that the very things that we're taught, certainly as a Black woman, you get education. Black women are the most credentialed, educated group of people in this country. But if you get an education and you do everything right, that the world's your oyster. And really, the results of the election, Kamala Harris could not have been more experienced and credentialed, um, running against a person like Trump. Um, and to still lose really is a very hard pill to swallow. But bigger than that, the things that we're taught about um, caring about your neighbor, um, about not being a bully, about being kind, about sticking up for people. Those things I was taught, half of the country does not believe in those things. So I'm grieving that, because how will women be treated as fully human without those things? So um, I'm sharing that to say that I'm going to take time, and I think a lot of us are taking time to heal ourselves, at least best we can. I think coming out of this, we need to have conversations and um, perhaps closed door conversations amongst women of color to talk about um, what's the dynamic, why groups did not come through for Kamala Harris the way that Black women did. And it can't be just dismissed as this is Black women for a Black woman, because Black women as a voting bloc have been standing up, certainly for the Democratic Party, but for candidates who are offering a more positive, expansive view of what America could be for many, many election cycles. So I think we need to have those conversations. And we need to figure out what solidarity looks like in this moment, because what's not changing is American demographics. That's the thing. Women of color are still the largest and fastest growing group of voters out there. So it's a reality we have to deal with. And Latinas, particularly Mexican American women who voted almost at the high percentage of Black men voted for Kamala Harris. We need to really understand how to build power and strengthen our coalitions around common issues. So I think that's the next step. Um, and I do think a lot of conversations around how do we protect people in this most immediate, because I hear Stephen Miller. I read Project 2025. I know the immediate plans of the Trump administration to begin mass deportations is going to affect people I love, and we have to figure out how to fight that. I think the conversations around how to defend our rights as women in the likely event of a national abortion ban, those things we need to discuss. So these are serious times we're moving into here in America.
I was about to ask, as you mentioned Project 2025 and the incoming Trump administration's plans, if there was a policy proposal that you and your community have been discussing the most and fear the most or plan to act the most? Again, recognizing that the election was still just a few days ago. So would it be what has your attention is the mass deportations, or is it all of it?
It seems like mass deportations most likely to be implemented most quickly. Um, National abortion ban implemented quickly. I think the House, I think the Senate majority, the majority in the Supreme Court and the White House means that they'll be able to implement their plans very quickly. The other thing is immunity for police officers. You remember, it was just a few years ago that we watched as George Floyd get murdered over like 9 minutes by a police officer, a guy who hadn't, been convicted of any crime, and it sparked a national movement. And the Trump administration's been very clear in Project 2025 that they plan to implement immunity for police officers. And so I believe that they'll be implementing a kind of a stop and frisk national policy that protects even wrongdoing on the part of police officers for unarmed citizens. All of those things are top of mind. All of them incredibly dangerous, and all of them will affect the lives of women in these very terrible ways. As for our young women and girls who are of that age where access to contraception is going to be an issue for them. So all of these things all at once, and they have the ability to implement these things in this first year, and it's got us concerned, it's got us worried, and for good reason.
Now, as of the moment that we are speaking, the House has not been called yet. Are you optimistic at all for the Democrats to win the seats that have not been called, or based on what you're seeing in exit polling, will the Republicans maintain control?
It's funny. I actually thought it was going to take about till today, as if we were talking several days after the election, to even determine, the results of the presidential. I had no idea that it would be settled so quickly, and so this is about right. Is to wait for every vote to be counted in these tight House seats. I'm optimistic because at least with a democratically controlled House, there is some point of contention for what the agenda of MAGA is, in the other branches of government. But I guess we'll wait and see. We've got some fantastic leaders. Alexandria Cortez, she won re-election. Rashida Tlaib out of Michigan won re-election. Ilhan Omar, and our newly elected congresswoman here in Oakland and Berkeley, Latifah Simon. She'll be a freshman. I mean, these are really amazing women of color who come from a variety of backgrounds, who have shown incredible courage and showed courage during Trump's first term. So we're going to rely on particularly the members of the House, these women of color, to stand up for what's right, even in the face of this overwhelming push to roll back rights and to try to take us back to like 1950 or before. I think their presence there in the House is going to make a big difference. And I will just say that we do have some voices in the Senate, and we shouldn't ignore that either. We don't have the majority, and we should be looking toward. I know it's probably too soon to say this, but we should be looking toward 2 years for the midterms, because it is possible to regain seats that are lost in the midterms, to give some kind of balance. Now, whether or not our voting rights are protected, I think, is going to be the big question as to whether that's going to be possible in 2 years.
You think before the 2026 midterms, there could be an action by the incoming Trump administration that would limit voting rights for women and people of color?
The problem is right now that we don't have federal protections, and that Republican-dominated state legislatures have already enacted voter suppression policies and practices and laws in more than 20 states. So the big hope that we'd had with Kamala Harris was to reinstate the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which made it illegal for states to implement voter suppression laws. We do not have those federal protections, and as a result, it's hard for people, if they, let's just use an example. On Tuesday, there's a county that Columbus, Ohio is in, where people stood in line for 6, 7 hours in a heavily Democratic district with one voting machine. That's voter suppression. And that's in play in lots and lots of states. So the fact that it's highly unlikely that our federal protections will be reinstated under a Trump administration. And in fact, these kinds of practices would be expanded and supported is highly likely. So if we read Project 2025, and I think we need to be an educated group of women that look at this as the playbook and the things there really is very few guardrails that are going to prevent a very speedy implementation of some of the biggest um, tenets of our democracy, and voting being one of them.
Now, you mentioned some of the down ballot race victories for women and women of color. And I want to ask you something that comes from a comment that I got on this week's Forbes Women newsletter, because I was writing about the power of female leadership, the power of women of color holding leadership positions. I quoted someone within the Forbes Women community saying she travels the world and she knows that when young girls around the world see women and women of color leading, it sends the message that they too can lead. And the comment I got was, why focus on race and gender? Isn't that a form of tokenization? And I've been mulling over that question because I've heard from female founders who don't like to be identified as female founders. They just want to do the work and be founders. But Amy, given that you run an organization dedicated to increasing political power for women of color, I want to pose the question to you. Why is it so important to identify race and gender in politics and beyond and do work around those issues?
Um, I will say to people who want to just put their heads down and do the work, take off identity out of any way of, defining who they are, that we can take those words out, but it won't change the way society and culture treats us, judges us, funds us. And for women of color, we understand something that we wish that was widely understood, is that in the United States, race is the biggest determinant of politics that there is. It's the biggest determinant of corporate power. Even in California, where many of us were behind an effort to make sure that that these corporate boards were comprised of 50% of women. Women are more than 50% of the population. We're not tokens. We're the majority of the population, yet we're a severe minority on corporate boards. Trying to pass a law in California that would require private companies to not exclude women from their governing boards, that passed and then was challenged and is not law right now. Our effort to make sure that we are recognized as women and as women of color in all the areas where we can express power and influence is extremely important. And ignoring it is not going to make the problem go away. And it's a very, very difficult thing for us to acknowledge that. Uh, I think a lot of people who voted this week are voting because voting, really what's happening in the background is they would rather vote for a convicted felon than a Black woman. And that's just at play right now. And it's something that we have to deal with. It's very painful for us to acknowledge it. Um, and I think it doesn't tokenize us. And in fact, I hold the opinion, and do many people, that it isn't just race that identifies us, that in the last decades, lots of different identities have been brought to the fore. Being LGBT, for example, at some point in our not too distant past, you had to be closeted. When I was in the military, it was a crime in the military, Uniform Code of Military Justice, to be gay, and that it's important for people to have that identity. So there's lots of other identities that we can't sweep under the rug. We can't say that they don't matter, that people can have those identities and be treated fairly is really the goal of what we should be working for.
That is a very fair and good point. Now, continuing on the trend, if you will, of the down ballot successes. Obviously, the presidential race has gotten a lot of attention and rightfully so, but within the Senate, there is a bit of history that happened. For the first time ever, two Black women have been elected to the Senate and will serve at the same time. We've had three Black women serving in the Senate in all of history, but never concurrent terms. So, can you talk about these Senate victories and what it says to you?
This might be my first smile in this whole conversation because things are so heavy and serious. But when I my first Senate campaign that I worked on was actually in Maryland. A congresswoman named Donna Edwards was running for Senate in Maryland, and Maryland, by the way, um, has the third highest population of Black people in the country, and she's a Black woman, and she was running 2014, I think it was, and I watched and got my heart broken as the Democratic Party donors and so-called experts really cut her campaign off at the knees very early in the primary. And now this year, to see that Angela Also Brooks, a very respected leader in Prince George's County, ran not only a credible campaign and raised quite a bit of money, but got the support, early support from the Democratic Party, got the support of the outgoing senator, which I think people can't underestimate how important it is to have people who are in positions of power be sponsors and support Black and brown women who are aspiring to these roles. And I think people in corporate will also identify with this power. But like she was able to beat back wealthy individuals, both in the primary and in the general, and now is the senator elect. And Angela Also Brooks, along with Lisa Blunt Rochester, who comes from Biden's home state, had the support of the outgoing senator, had the president's support, served on Biden's transition team, and now is our senator elect. And I know from talking to Kamala Harris when she was a senator, and talking to people who have been in the Senate, that it makes a difference to have two Black women. And so anyone who hasn't been in elected office knows that you need probably like three people to have like a consensus in any particular group. But this is just so historic and so important. And they're going to have a tough go at it. But I think whenever you have Black women who are able to break one of the toughest barriers in American politics, which is to be in the Senate, which has been dominated by white men, it's a huge win. And we can't ignore that was possible. It wasn't possible in 2014, but it was possible in 2024.
And that's just 10 years. So some of those victories can show what can happen, which is why when I hear people saying right now, we'll never see a female president in our lifetimes, it depends on the age of the person, of course, but if I hear a young person, someone younger than me, say that, it's moments like that which you just referenced, the change in 10 years that we can see. And the other thing I just want to double click on is the Senate support from the outgoing senator. How crucial is that, or how much of a lesson is that for others who wish to run for the Senate?
Let me say, when I watched that happen, it had never happened before. It never happened before. It didn't happen with Kamala Harris when we in California elected her a senator. She did not have the support of outgoing senator. She did not. So I saw it's this alchemy, that a path to one of the hardest and most expensive elected positions, a senator, is possible because you have essentially white men who are exiting a role, they're retiring, they're leaving, endorsing a Black woman in the primary, and endorsing signals in electoral politics. Hey, donors, write her a check. Hey, media, she's electable. Hey, consultants, go work for her. And all of those things are the ingredients, now we know, of a successful path for a Black woman to win the elected office. I personally want to study a lot more about the path to success for Lisa Blunt Rochester and Angela Also Brooks. And then I had a front row seat to when it doesn't work. In California, Barbara Lee was one. She was one of two women who was running in the primary. Adam Schiff was the person who succeeded in the primary for the Senate seat in California. And I saw on the negative, because Feinstein didn't weigh in, because Nancy Pelosi, who's not obviously a senator, but she's very powerful in California, she did not put her force behind one of the women. It was the man who won. So in the negative, we can see what happens, but on the positive, we can see what's possible. And I think one of the ways that we women and women of color need to be learning is, how do we partner with people who are in power to be sponsored? I mean, I think in corporate, you think of it as a sponsorship, but in politics, it really works the same way. And we see how, because this happened for the first time in this election cycle, it made all the difference for representation. And I think we got to lean into how do we make that possible, going forward.
I was just about to say the number of female founders and CEOs I speak to who talk about a male sponsor who helped them get to that seat, it's not quite 100%. There are women who help women or gender nonconforming, non-binary, but there are a lot of women who say, yeah, it was that male CFO who said I could do this, and now I'm CEO. So perhaps there are lessons from the corporate world for.
There has to be. Yeah, there has to be. Because if we say, okay, you women can be at the very top levels, but how do you do it? And I know as a Black woman, we're always saying, you need a mentor, talk to a mentor. But you and I both know that's not how you get at the highest level. Is just, spending time talking about, mentoring topics. It really is, get me in the door, get me the money, put me in front of people, validate my perspective. And the way that it works in the C-suite is the exact same way it works in politics for women.
I want to end on what is hopefully a positive note. So you founded She the People in 2018 after Trump was elected the first time. And we have seen through the data, the Center for American Women in Politics has covered this extensively, how many women ran for down ballot races for local seats after the 2016 election. And there are more women in politics today as a result of that pink wave in 2018. So, Amy, do you think 2024 will serve as a similar catalyst for women getting involved, even on their school boards, for state elections, for local elections?
Um, I want to say, it's important for us, even when we're facing this crushing loss. We don't have the first woman president. We don't have that, but we do have activated communities. And to the extent that we have this deep bench of really talented people that should be in public office, they should not be discouraged. I hope that this is a moment where we have a new crop of women who want to stand for leadership. Now, they got to be fighters, because the moment we're in requires people to be fighters, but they have to know that they're not alone. There's a lot of us who want to see this happen and want to activate that next generation. So, in answer to your question, um, if there's anything I could do, if the last 8 years has proven that we can change things, we can't change everything, not all at once, then the next 8 years should prove that the next generation, that a lot more is possible. And for us to stay encouraged, we should grieve now and then be ready to fight for this country and the things that we know are right. Let us not let Trump have the last word about who we are as women. Let us have the last word. And I think that does start at every level of government. So I encourage people, maybe not this week, maybe not next week, but soon, to think about how they can serve.
And with that last word from you, Amy Allison, founder of She the People, I will say thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate your time, your work, and your insight today.
Thanks so much.